Questions on passage of H.R. 3401? Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Ms. McSally. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Brown, Durbin, Jones, Kane, Leahy, Reed, Schumer, Warner, and Whitehouse. Senators voting in the negative: Cassidy, Cornyn, Kramer, Enzi, Gardner, Grassley, Hawley, Isaacson, Murkowski, Hall, Perdue, Risch, Roberts, Scott of Florida, Shelby, and Thune. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Alexander, no. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Crapo, no. Mrs. Fisher, no. Ms. McSally, no. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mrs. Hyde Smith, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Romney, Mr. Romney, no. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Ms. Stabenow, Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Portman, Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Lee, Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Langford, Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Brasso, Mr. Brasso, no. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, Mr. Toomey, no. Ms. Baldwin, Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mrs. Murray, Mrs. Murray, aye. Ms. Hirono, Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Daines, Mr. Daines, no. Mr. Casey, Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Wyden, Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Burr, Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mrs. Capito, Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Kennedy, no. Ms. Hassan, aye. Miss Cinema, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Udall, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Braun, no. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Ms. Smith, Ms. Smith, aye. Ms. Cantwell, Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Coons, Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. McConnell, Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Duckworth, Ms. Duckworth, aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, no. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye.
Not on this vote, the yeas are 37, the nays are 55. The 60-vote threshold having not been achieved, the bill is not passed. Democratic Leader.
I would ask to address the Senate briefly on leader time.
Senate will be in order. Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. So the bill that was before us has failed. Most of us on this side of the aisle would have much preferred that bill, but that has failed. The bill that Senators Shelby and Leahy have worked on diligently is now before us. I'm going to vote for it. I think most of us on this side are going to vote for it so that we can quickly move to conference. Speaker Pelosi has called the president and suggested a few changes. I think they are 4 changes to this bill. We could quickly have a conference, talk about those 4 changes, try to get them in the bill, and finish this quickly, and I hope that's what will happen. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, I call up my amendment number 901.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Alabama, Mr. Shelby, proposes an amendment numbered 901. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following.
President, I ask that consent that the reading be waived.
Without objection.
Ask yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second?
Mr.
There appears
President.
to be. The yeas and nays are ordered.
Mr. President,
Senator from Kentucky.
I call up my amendment number 902.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Kentucky, Mr. Paul, proposes an amendment numbered 902 to amendment numbered 901. At the appropriate place, insert the following. Section of the unobligated balances for fiscal year 2019, they are hereby rescinded.
I ask consent that the reading be waived.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we are going to spend over $4 billion today, and I just propose that we pay for it. There is a humanitarian crisis at the border, but there's also a debt crisis. We spend hundreds of millions, if not billions, on wasteful projects. Let's take it from foreign aid welfare and spend it on our southern border. We spend hundreds of thousands of dollars subsidizing guinea pig farmers in Peru.
Senate will be in order.
A llama fair in Bolivia, advertisements to buy carbon credits in Mexico. $273 million was spent trying to teach foreigners how to fill out grant applications to get more welfare from the U.S. $300,000 to help Brazilians get off Brazilian welfare. $500,000 spent jump-starting the Haitian film industry. There are billions of dollars that we can spend on the southern border, but we should take it from somewhere and not add it to the debt of our kids and our grandkids.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Carolina.
Mr. President, I'm going to move to table this amendment. Being the chairman of the Foreign Ops Subcommittee, this is taking one disaster and creating 100 in its place. This $4.6 billion will destroy all the humanitarian assistance we passed to deal with an unprecedented wave of refugees. The global health programs are all impacted severely. PEPFAR, the Child Survival and Maternal Health Programs, this money comes out of those accounts. Can you imagine how it's going to be to deal with Ebola after cutting the global health program? Programs to counter the influence of Russia and China will be zeroed out. Counter-human trafficking programs will be dramatically reduced. Counterterrorism programs are all affected by this amendment. You're taking one problem at the border, and if you enact the Paul Amendment, you're going to create 100 in its place. So I move to table the Paul Amendment number 902 and ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the remaining votes in this series be 10 minutes in length.
5 minutes. Is there objection? 5 minutes. Without objection. The clerk will call a roll on the motion to table.
Mr. Alexander. Okay. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito. Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Cassidy, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Kramer, Daines, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gardner, Hassan, Heinrich, Hirono, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson, Jones, King, Leahy, Markey, McConnell, McSally, Menendez, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Peters, Portman, Reed, Risch, Roberts, Romney, Rosen, Rubio, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Shelby, Cinema, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Thune, Van Hollen, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Graham, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Blackburn, Enzi, Grassley, Kennedy, Lankford, Paul, Perdue, and Toomey. Mr. Manchin, aye. Ms. Ernst, no. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Tillis, no. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Udall, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner. Aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz. No. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun. No. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski. Aye.
Or to change their vote? If not, the yeas are 77, the nays are 15. The motion to proceed is agreed to. Motion to table is agreed to. Question is on Amendment 901. The yeas and nays were previously ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Barrasso, Blackburn, Blumenthal, Blunt, Brown, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Cassidy, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Duckworth, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hassan, Hawley, Heinrich, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson, Jones, Kennedy, King, Langford, Manchin, McSally, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Peters, Reed, Risch, Romney, Rosen, Rubio, Sass, Schumer, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shaheen, Smith, Stabenow, Sullivan, Tester, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Whitehouse, and Wicker. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Braun, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Hirono, Lee, Markey, Merkley, and Paul. Mr. Menendez, no. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Purdue, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Coons, aye.
This is going to.
Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Udall, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. McConnell, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 84 and the nays are 8. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is agreed to. The clerk will read the bill for the third time.
H.R. 3401, an act making emergency supplemental appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2019, and for other purposes.
Is there sufficient second? There appears to be. There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Ms. Rosen, Cortez Master. Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, not on this. Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar. Thank you. Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Markley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Cinema, Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Barrasso, Blackburn, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Braun, Capito, Casey, Cassidy, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Kramer, Crapo, Daines, Enzi, Feinstein, Gardner, Graham, Hassan, Hawley, Heinrich, Hoven, Isaacson, Johnson, Jones, Kane, Kennedy, King, Langford, Leahy, Manchin, McConnell, McSally, Moran, Murphy, Murray, Perdue, Portman, Peters, Portman, Reed, Roberts, Romney, Rosen, Rubio, Schatz, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Stabenow, Sullivan, Tester, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Warner, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Hirono, Markey, Menendez, and Paul. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mrs. Hyde Smith, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe? Aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley? Aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst? Aye. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander? Aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin? Aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall? Aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz? Aye. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 84 and the nays are 8. The 60-vote threshold having been achieved, the bill, as amended, is passed. Later.
I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding Rule 22, the cloture motions filed on Senate Amendment numbers 764 and S-1790 are at a time to be determined by the Majority Leader in consultation with the Democratic Leader.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, I'm glad that the bipartisan Senate border supplemental has passed with an overwhelming vote. I commend Chairman Shelby, Senator Leahy, and the members of the Appropriations Committee for breaking the logjam. On NDAA, the Democratic leader and I have had extensive discussions on the path forward on the defense bill. So, for the information of all of our colleagues, we intend to stay in session this week to finish the NDAA bill and allow for a vote in relation to the Udall amendment. Senators should plan to vote on Friday on the Udall amendment, but the vote, here's the good news, the vote will start first thing in the morning and be held open into the afternoon to accommodate as many senators as possible. So to be clear, obviously I believe the Udall Amendment can and should be defeated, I hope with a resounding vote in the Senate, and we should put this issue to rest before we break for the 4th of July recess. Holding up the defense authorization bill is not an acceptable outcome.
Mr. President.
Democratic leader.
Well, first, I want to thank the Majority Leader for understanding how strongly we feel on the Democratic side, and many Americans feel, that the constitutional right of Congress to examine foreign conflict and potential war be upheld. The fact that we will get a vote on the Udall Amendment, something we have asked for, is only fair and only right. There may be differences of viewpoint between both sides, but the fact that it will be on the floor and be debated is exactly the right thing to do, something we want and have asked for, and I thank the Majority Leader for understanding that and allowing that to happen.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
President,
Senator from Hawaii.
are we in a quorum call?
We are,
I ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
without objection.
Madam President, Donald Trump and the hawks in his administration are fueling a dangerous escalation with Iran. And instead of taking responsibility for this escalation, the president is once again blaming others for a crisis of his own making. Adding to the confusion and concern is the president's penchant for using his Twitter account or an outburst from the Oval Office to jump between calling for restraint and embracing a potential war. Instead of listening to the president's latest outburst or dissecting his latest tweet, let's take a hard look at what he's done to bring us to this dangerous moment. In May 2018, Trump followed the lead of the hawks in his administration and unilaterally pulled out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, breaking the agreement and leaving its other signatories, especially our allies in Europe, holding the bag. Only a few weeks earlier, Jim Mattis, the president's own Secretary of Defense, told the Senate Armed Services Committee, on which I sit, that their agreement was working as intended and had been written with an assumption that Iran would try to cheat. He went on to note that while the deal was imperfect, it established a strong verification and inspection regime, and that Iran was complying with the agreement. I continue to agree with Secretary Mattis's conclusions. The purpose of the JCPOA was to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon within a 2 to 3 month time frame. That is the kind of time frame we were looking at. The JCPOA was not intended to cover Iran's ballistic missile program or its malign activities throughout the region. What the JCPOA did accomplish, however, was lengthening Iran's nuclear breakout capacity from 3 months to 1 year. It included strong limitations on enrichment, redesigned and rebuilt the Arak heavy water reactor so it can only be used for peaceful use research purposes and not for the enrichment of weapons-grade plutonium, and required Iran to ship all spent nuclear fuel out of the country. The agreement also included a binding commitment from Iran to never pursue a nuclear weapons program. That is in the very beginning part of the JCPOA document. This commitment necessitated a continuous inspection regime by the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. Further, the agreement included provisions that would see the international community reimpose sanctions automatically, the snapback, if Iran was violating the deal. Instead of building upon the JCPOA to address Iran's other malign activities, Donald Trump threw out all the benefits of the deal, took on an enormous risk, and isolated the United States in the process. In early April, the president took the unprecedented step of designating the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the JRGC, a terrorist organization. He designated the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization. That was an unprecedented step, overruling the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dunford, in the process. General Dunford argued that this first-of-its-kind step would put American troops in the region at risk for retaliation. He was right. Later that month, Donald Trump rescinded waivers granted to key American allies like Japan and India to purchase Iranian oil, effectively strangling the Iranian economy in the process. Over the past few months, the administration has sent thousands of additional troops in a carrier strike group to the Persian Gulf. These actions, taken unilaterally, have isolated the United States from our allies, encouraged Iran to stop complying with elements of the nuclear deal, and to step up their aggressive actions in the region, and brought us to the dangerous precipice of war. Although the president made the 11th hour decision, actually 10 minutes before a strike, to call off a military response to Iran's downing of an Air Force drone. The fact that we got so close to a military strike is chilling, given the implications of igniting an open war with Iran. We've learned, to our peril, over the past few years, that Donald Trump does not keep his word or the word of our country. He says something one day, only to reverse himself at a moment's notice. We cannot rely on his restraint to avoid blundering into a war with Iran. That's why I'm continuing to call on my colleagues to join in demanding a vote on Senator Udall's amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act. This amendment makes clear that only Congress can authorize the use of military force against Iran and would provide a clear check on Donald Trump, John Bolton, and other hawks in the administration. Right now, the Senate Majority Leader is blocking consideration of this amendment in defense of Trump. As long as he refuses to allow a vote on this amendment, I will vote against proceeding with the NDAA and call on my colleagues to do likewise. We cannot allow this administration and this president a free hand to stack the deck toward military action and away from meaningful diplomacy. Otherwise, we risk committing another generation of American soldiers to a protracted, disastrous war in the Middle East. I yield the floor.
Madam President,
Senator from Michigan.
are we under a quorum call, Madam President?
We are not.
All right, thank you very much. Madam President, I rise today to pay tribute to my longtime staff member and friend, Bill Sweeney, who will be moving on to a new challenge in his career after nearly 20 years of service on my team. Bill actually started working on the campaign November 1, 1999, and we were sharing stories of his being up in a crowded little space, changing my Stabenow for the U.S. Congress signs to Stabenow for U.S. Senate signs with little stickers that we put over, because we didn't have very much money at the time. And so Bill has been with me a long, long time, and after so many years, it's tough to know what to say because there's so much to say. Bill Sweeney has worn more hats on my team than anyone ever has. He started working on my campaign, as I mentioned, for the U.S. Senate as a fundraiser. After the campaign, I hired him as my systems administrator, and he played an integral role in setting up my new Senate office. And by the way, the systems he set up, we are still using today, and I truly believe they are the best that the Senate has. After a short time, I promoted him to Director of Information Technology. And then Bill's gift for messaging and writing led to more promotions as my Director of Outreach, speechwriter, and then Senior Communications Advisor. Eventually, he took on a broader role on my team as Deputy Chief of Staff, and his position now is Staff Director of the Democratic Policy in the Communications Committee. But these are just Bill's official titles. He's been a key strategist, a writer, a crisis manager, an event planner, grammarian, computer programmer, and graphic designer. From directing key communications initiatives to designing floor charts, no job has been too big or too small for Bill, and I will be forever grateful. He has drafted and edited countless speeches, columns, releases, constituent letters, statements, and talking points over the years. Born and raised in Michigan, he has always been able to capture the values and the heart of Michigan in his writing. His attention to detail is impeccable. He's an expert on proofreading and has impressively planned and organized our annual caucus retreats and has provided us with extraordinary experiences and speakers. Bill's also one of the most creative people I know. From designing logos to inventing the Velcro countdown floor chart, like the one that you see here that shows how many days Bill has worked for me in the United States Senate. See, it's actually very cool. I have to show you. See, they come off. Isn't that cool? That's pretty inventive, I think. All right. So, whenever you see these on the floor of the United States Senate, you can think of Bill Sweeney. So we had to make sure Bill had his own chart before leaving. He is someone who has always been able to make something look good and function well at the same time. He has a passion for organization. He designed many of the systems that my office relies on to run efficiently today. As I said earlier, we literally are using integrated systems that Bill has designed over the years. Bill's also one of the smartest people I know. I will miss his sharp wit and his sense of humor. With all the hats Bill's worn, he's leaving very big shoes to fill. I will always be incredibly grateful for his loyalty, his work ethic, his friendship, and passion for service. Bill will be joining the team at AARP and continuing to work on so many issues that we have championed together over the years. I wish him incredible success and happiness in his new chapter in this career. I apologize, but I'm so happy he's moving on to a big challenge and yet so sorry to lose him. Thank you, Bill. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Go. Madam President.
Senator from Oregon.
Thank you, Madam President. Are we in a quorum call?
We are,
Ask that it be lifted.
without objection.
Thank you very much. The three most important words in our Constitution are the first three, we the people. That's what our entire vision of our form of government is about. There was a lot of discussion among the founders. How do we make sure that we don't end up with the equivalent of a king here in the United States of America? Because with a king, you get government by and for the king and the king's circle, the powerful circle at the top rather than the people. Unfortunately, that vision in America is being challenged. Challenged because we have a fundamental concentration of power through dark money in campaigns, through gerrymandering, through voter suppression and intimidation. And the result is a shredding of the vision of our Constitution. We have a responsibility here in the Senate to fix that. And that's why we should be considering the For the People Act that takes on gerrymandering and voter suppression and dark money. If we want evidence of just exactly how corrupted the system has become, go no further than to look at drug companies gouging Americans on drug prices. Today, I'm introducing the End Price Gouging for Medications Act to stop the pharmaceutical companies' greed and give Americans much-needed relief. The average American spends about $1,000 per year on medication. That's 11 times what they spent in 1960. More than half of Americans take at least one prescription medication, about 60% of us. A quarter of them say that they or a family member has not filled a prescription, or has cut pills in half, or has skipped doses because of the cost. And those costs just keep going right on up. January through June 2018, there were price increases on 4,412 drugs and decreases on just 46. That's a ratio that approaches 100 to 1. For every 100 drugs that go up in price, one comes down a little. So we're clearly failing to tackle this problem. And I hear it from my constituents back in Oregon. Bonnie Davis from Cresswell, a senior citizen on a fixed income, diabetic for 30 years. She was prescribed 2 new kinds of insulin in December. Bydureon, well, it costs $1,927 for a 3-month supply. Lantus Solo Star, $1,952. She'll pay more than $5,000 out of pocket by the end of the year. In 1972, insulin cost just $1.49 per vial. What an incredible difference on a product that's been around forever. Her 2 adult children are living in Germany. They thought about coming back here to the United States of America, but decided not to for one simple reason: the cost of health care in the United States of America, and specifically the cost of medications. I come from Douglas County, little Timber County in southern Oregon, and Leslie Rogers comes from that county. She comes from Roseburg, town I went to first grade in. And Leslie shared his daughter Gloria's story at one of my town halls. Gloria suffers from a rare genetic condition called West syndrome. And she lives, therefore, in near constant fear of seizures and cystic fibrosis. It's treatable. It's treatable with a drug called ACTH. It was invented in the 1950s. Previously, it cost $40 a vial. $40. But in 8 years, the cost has grown to $45,000. Yes, you heard that right, from $40 to $45,000, more than 1,000 times increase. Company that makes the drug bought the rights to and blocked a $200 synthetic ACTH treatment used in Canada to prevent it from coming to the United States. So they're making a lot of money by blocking a generic synthetic competitor. Hospitalization, he says, Leslie Rogers says, hospitalization and treatment drove my family to the edge of bankruptcy, and my daughter was left tube-fed and suction-dependent due to the treatment delays, fighting with insurance over the drug price. How would you feel if your daughter or your son was left in a situation of being tube-fed and suction-dependent because you couldn't afford the drug, because the drug had increased in price 1,000 times? The cost of another drug used to treat the disease, Vigabatrin, has also skyrocketed after makers saw what the first company was able to get away with. It cost about $1,500 a month 3 years ago, and $1,500 is a lot. But how much does it cost today? $26,000 per month. Roughly a 20-fold increase. And Leslie Rogers notes, this price gouging has led to thousands of children since we first spoke to suffer the same fate as my daughter. Severe brain damage, cerebral palsy, reliance on tube feedings, and many have died. Let's be clear, the price gouging in America isn't just about the pocketbook. It's about health. It's about life or death for many people. Now, this situation doesn't exist in other countries. The whole entire price regime is different. Let's take an example. Humira, a common drug for rheumatoid arthritis. Here in the United States, it's about $2,700 per dose. In the United Kingdom, it's $1,362. Why does it cost twice in the United States of America for this drug, this common drug? Or Crestor, which is used to treat high cholesterol. It's $216 in the United States. It's $32 in France. So crudely, a 7-fold increase in the United States over France. Why do we pay 7 times as much as the people in France? Or Harvoni, used to treat hepatitis C. $13,000 in Japan, and 3 times as much, $30,000 in the United States. Why do we pay 3 times what they pay in Japan for this drug? Januvia, that used to treat type 2 diabetes. $34 in Australia, $331 in the United States of America, a 10-fold increase. Why do we pay 10 times as much as people in Australia? There is an answer to the question, a question of why we pay so much for Humira or Crestor or Harvoni or Januvia. Very simply, other governments negotiate the price. You want to sell in our country? We negotiate the price. We don't. Now, the reason why don't we pick up and do for Americans what the government of Australia does for Australians? Or the government of the United Kingdom does for their citizens? Or the government of France does it for their citizens? Why don't we do for our citizens the same good work in negotiating the price that other governments do? What's wrong with our government? What's wrong with this chamber? And it's corruption. It's the absolute corruption of money in campaigns. So who are we serving here in this chamber? Are we serving the people? Or are we serving the drug companies? That's the question every member of this chamber should struggle with. In the United States, drug companies set the price, and we don't negotiate. In fact, the U.S. government has set a law saying the U.S. government can't negotiate. Why would we do that? Why would we do that to ourselves? Why would we do that to the people of this country who cannot afford the drugs because we make them far more expensive than anywhere else in the world. Well, we shouldn't. And that's why I've introduced the End Price Gouging for Medications Act. On behalf of the people of America, we need to end the drug gouging. Now, I do a lot of town halls. I do one in every county every year. I have 36 counties in Oregon, open hour for people to ask questions. They are blue counties and they are red counties. 22 of my 36 are about as red as the reddest counties you'll find in America. And I ask people, how many people here at this town hall like getting gouged on drugs? And nobody does. How many people like paying 2 or 5 or 10 times more than the citizens of other developed countries? No one likes it. America is united. Rural America, urban America. Blue America, red America. Young America, old America. America is united to end this drug gouging. So why don't we act? I challenge my colleagues. Come here and work for the people of the United States of America rather than the drug companies' profits. It's time to stand up. Stand up against those companies. This plan is quite simple. It says you can't sell the drug for more than the median price of what you sell it for in Australia, Japan, Canada, and the largest European countries. That's simple, the median price in those markets. You want to raise your prices in America, you got to raise your prices in those countries. That way, we all get a fair deal. This would stop the drug gouging of Americans overnight. This is quite simple, but you may ask, how's it enforced? How do you make sure that this happens? Well, it's this. The difference between the reference price, the median price in those countries, and the price a drug company sells their product at. If they sell it for more than the median price, the penalty is 5 times the difference. If they sell it for $1,000 more per dose over the median price, the penalty is $5,000. That gets people's attention. Drug companies don't want to be paying massive penalties. And where do the fines go? They go to the NIH for drug research and development. No, this myth that we're not going to invest in drug development, the basic science is done by NIH, and this would fund NIH. Americans have been ripped off. Americans have been gouged. But it is this chamber that is allowing it to happen. Who here wants to come and say they are for the drug gouging of Americans? Well, I can tell you, America is not with you if you are supporting the drug gouging of our citizens. So let's have the courage to carry the fight for the people, not the powerful. Thank you, Mr. President, Madam President. And I do ask in closing consent for my intern, Taylor White, to have the privileges of the floor for the balance of the day.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Madam President.
Senator from Ohio.
Madam President, I'd like to speak about the legislation that is before us right now here on the floor, and that is the annual National Defense Authorization Act. Incredibly important legislation that the Senate pretty much every year is able to pass on a bipartisan basis. It's really an exception to so much else we are locked up on here with partisan gridlock. With regard to our troops, we tend to come together as Republicans and Democrats and make commitments to them that we're going to give our men and women serving in the armed forces the resources and support they need to carry out their critical missions. We have now proceeded to that legislation. I want to talk a little about it. It has a lot of incredibly important things in it. It's really important to Ohio. In my state of Ohio, we have a lot of defense installations. They're very important to our national security because they do important work. They're also important to our Ohio economy. Ohio's defense spending now accounts for more than 66,000 direct jobs, more than $4 billion in salaries, and more than a $14 billion economic impact. 43 of our 88 counties in Ohio are impacted by these facilities, so they're critical to our state, to our economy, to our soldiers and their families, to tens and thousands of civilian employees as well. And again, because of the good work being done in Ohio, including at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is our largest single employer in Ohio, it's really important to our military readiness, to our national security. This bill has proceeded through the Armed Services Committee in its bipartisan manner that it usually is done. I love seeing that. It's legislation that every member of this body, I hope, will be able to support at the end. It has a lot of important initiatives and some much-needed reforms. Included, by the way, this year is a 3.1% pay raise for our troops. I think that's necessary. They're in harm's way around the world. They are ensuring our safety, and we should ensure that they're fairly compensated for their hard work and their sacrifices. One of the other bill's important initiatives that has a big impact on my state is authorizing $1.7 billion to increase the rate of production for both our M1 Abrams tanks and also upgrades to 165 tanks that are already in service. That's an increase from last year's figure. It also authorizes about $249 million to upgrade the Stryker armored fighting vehicles. This is great news for the men and women who are out in the field in our armed forces. They love these vehicles, and they need them. The Abrams and the Stryker are the most advanced and lethal tanks and armored vehicles on the battlefield today. One of our priorities here in Congress should be to be sure that we're providing our troops with what they need to be able to do their duty and to protect themselves. We want to be sure they have the highest quality equipment to be able to do that. Only by ensuring that these funds are allocated to such key vehicles like this can we be sure our armed forces are able to maintain their advantage, their qualitative advantage on the battlefield. This isn't just a big win for our military, however, it's also a big win for a plant called the Joint Systems Manufacturing Center, JSMC, which is the Lima tank plant in Lima, Ohio. The best tanks and armored vehicles in the world are made at this plant. It's the best workforce in the world to do it. I've seen them in action many times. It's the only facility in the United States that has the capacity to produce tanks like the Abrams tanks and the Stryker armored vehicle. It's a really important strategic asset for our country in Lima, Ohio. Having been out there a lot, visited with the workers, watched them work, see what they can make, and having talked to the soldiers in the field who use these products, I can tell you how important they are. Most recently, I was at the Lima tank plant in March, where I was able to speak directly with the workers there about the long-term health of the Lima plant, which the Obama administration, about 8 years ago, attempted to shutter. The president sent a budget to Congress, President Obama, saying, we'd like to close down the tank plant because in the future we won't need these tanks, at least not immediately, and someday we'll have a new generation of tanks. Meanwhile, let's just shut down this plant. Some of us stood up, and I fought against that. And we were able to convince the United States Congress to overturn what the president wanted to do and instead to provide funding for the tank plant, to keep it open. Even though production was down at that time, we were able to keep the plant open and not have it be mothballed as the administration wanted to do. Thank goodness we did that, because now we know, particularly with the Russian influence in Europe and what our allies are telling us they need, we have to have these armored vehicles and these tanks, and we need to continually upgrade them. If we had shut down that plant, we would have lost this incredible workforce that is there, building something that is unique. There's nothing quite like the welding, as an example, and the cutting that goes into our tanks. We also would have lost the supply chain. That would have been detrimental. It would have cost taxpayers so much more to try to take that plant out of mothballs and recreate it again than to keep it open as we did. Now, frankly, we kept it open mostly through foreign sales. Other countries around the world, including our allies, were still buying Abrams tanks and Stryker vehicles, and Israel was buying the Namir vehicle, which is an armored vehicle that is much like our Abrams tank without the turret. That kept us going, plus a little bit of upgrades to our tanks. Now, today again, and since 8 years ago, when there was a proposal to shutter this plant, we've been able to increase production slowly but surely, to the point that today we have the ability to really have that plant humming. We have a lot of people there working. It's on its way up, and that's really exciting. The funding allocated under this legislation we've talked about today is really important because it'll allow this JSMC, the Lima Tank Plant, to hire, to train, and retain more workers dedicated to making the best equipment possible to protect our troops. And I'll tell you, the workers at the tank plant are very proud of what they do. A lot of them are veterans. They know that what they're doing every day by providing these armored vehicles has the potential to save the lives of the American men and women in uniform across the world who are relying on these vehicles to keep them safe and to be able to have that qualitative advantage on the battlefield by having the best equipment possible. Last year, I had the opportunity to be the first member of Congress to see the latest models of the Stryker Dragoon vehicles, up-armored at Lima. This was a real fight also. The Army came to us, said we need to have some additional capability with regard to our Stryker vehicles to be able to push back against the potential threats on the European continent. At that time, we had no tanks in Europe, and we needed to upgrade what the Strykers could do by providing for additional lethality, particularly to provide a turret on top of the Stryker vehicle. We did that, and now, as I saw with the 2nd Cavalry Regiment in Germany, they're using these vehicles. And those drivers of those vehicles, those other troops who are using those vehicles, they love them. It feels like, again, it gives them the ability to be effective on the battlefield. They're also training with a coalition of our allies, including Poland, the UK, and Denmark. The work our men and women in uniform are doing with our allies in Europe is vitally important because it forms a framework of defense to protect our NATO allies from aggression. The importance of American military presence in Europe has never been in doubt, but perhaps now, more than any time since the end of the Cold War, the security of Europe is uncertain. We've seen repeatedly these past few years instances of military aggression, electoral interference, and diplomatic provocations by Russia toward its Western neighbors. Nowhere is Russia's continued malign behavior on display more than in the country of Ukraine. For the past 5 years, we've seen Ukraine work to break free of Russia's orbit and seek greater integration with the democratic framework of the West, with the EU, with the United States, with our NATO allies, most vividly during the 2014 Maidan protests in Kyiv. Russia responded to these appeals to democracy by illegally invading and annexing Crimea, which remains occupied in violation of international law to this day. In the eastern region of Donbass, more than 4,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed fighting Russian-backed separatists. I've been to the front lines, the so-called line of contact in the Donbass, and let me tell you, it's very much a hot war. And just last November, the Russian Navy attacked 3 Ukrainian naval vessels and captured 24 Ukrainian sailors in international waters near the Kerch Strait. These individuals remain unlawfully detained by the Russian government to this day, and I urge my Senate colleagues and the entire international community to join me in calling for the release of those sailors. I know here on this side of the Atlantic, what's happening in Ukraine can sometimes seem like it's half a world away, but it's not. It's very relevant. In a sense, it's where the modern battle is taking place between 2 different ideologies, between whether a country wants to go toward freedom and democracy in the West, or whether, again, to stay under the orbit of the Russian influence. Here in Ohio, we have a large and vibrant Ukrainian-American community, particularly in Northeast Ohio, who have a vested interest in seeing that their ancestral homeland can defend itself from Russian aggression as it works to align itself more with NATO and the West while promoting a platform of democracy and freedom, transparency and free markets. And frankly, we should all be supportive of Ukraine's efforts to reshape itself as a beacon of liberty in the region. As co-chair of the Senate Ukraine Caucus, which I co-founded with my colleague Dick Durbin, I've been an advocate for continued support of Ukraine as it works to break free from Russia's influence. Last month, I traveled to Kyiv to meet with the newly elected president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, and I'm encouraged from my meetings that they will stay on the right track toward reform. But to properly do so, they've also got to be able to defend themselves from this Russian aggression. For the past 3 years, I successfully introduced and passed amendments to the legislation before us today, the National Defense Authorization Act, that expands U.S. military aid to Ukraine. These provisions built and expanded the primary statutory framework for the U.S. security assistance to Ukraine, the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. This year, I was pleased to see a further $300 million authorized in lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine in the NDAA, in this legislation. This security assistance package is good news, and it sends a strong signal that America continues to stand with the Ukrainian people and will make sure their military has the capabilities it needs to defend its sovereign territory on the land, in the sea, and in the air. But our commitment to Ukraine's security should extend to other forms of support as well. I've authored an amendment that I hope will be included in the final bill to pressure Russia to release the Ukrainian sailors kidnapped in the Kerch Strait. It would do so by adding the release of the 24 Ukrainian sailors as a condition for any U.S. military cooperation with Russia. We need to take a firm stance against Russia's blatant disregard for international law in this matter, and passing this amendment would help us do so. I'm glad to see that the National Defense Authorization Act will keep the lines of production running on the factory floors in Lima, going out to the front lines all around the world. And I'm glad we'll be continuing to help Ukraine defend itself from unlawful Russian aggression. I hope we can also push for the release of these Ukrainian sailors who have been detained illegally in the Kerch Strait. I look forward to voting on the bill's final passage here in the Senate in the next week so that the men and women who give us so much and give so much of themselves to keep us safe have the resources they need to fulfill their important mission. Thank you, Madam President. I yield back. And I note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.